So I'll just speed through a quick introduction to our generous speakers today, Sharon, Love and Vicki Yorke-Edwards. Both of our speakers have actually made important changes and moves around in their careers in recent years, so that's interesting to think about and hear about. Sharon was originally a trial statistician and led a very large team of statisticians who were working on a large number of trials, 60 trials. About a year ago, she changed her career to start looking at trial conduct issues, so her work is very relevant to us, and she's focusing on monitoring as one of her main interests. Vicki recently started in a post as Research Fellow for Trial Conduct Methodology with Sharon at the MRC CTU at UCL, where they both are. And she'd spent quite a long time, 13 years, working in trials in data and trial management. So what she's interested in is helping to develop an evidence base for conduct. And her particular issues are in data quality monitoring and data sharing. And I think we should very quickly move on to the presentation they're going to give us today about how phase 3 trials are monitored in the UK. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Vicki Yorke-Edwards, and I'm going to be taking you through the first part of our presentation on how a phase 3 CTIMP trials in the UK monitored the story from the registered CTUs. I'll then hand over to Sharon for the last part of our talk. Okay, so the basic plan for this presentation is I'll take you through a very brief introduction to monitoring, why we do it and some definitions, and then I will discuss the monitoring survey that we sent out, talking about why we did it and what it covered. I'll then go through our preliminary survey results, looking specifically at central monitoring and on-site monitoring, and we'll finish with an interpretation of the survey and some details of our future plans. Okay, so why do we monitor? Well, ICH GCP has some things to say about this. There's a lot of text, but basically it boils down to we do this to protect our participants, to ensure the quality of the efficacy and safety data, and to ensure consistent, compliant conduct across sites and/or countries. Monitoring could be divided into two main areas, that's central and on-site monitoring. On-site monitoring could be defined as visiting sites for the purposes of oversight. For central monitoring, the ICH GCP addendum now has its own definition. Centralized monitoring is a remote evaluation of accumulating data performed in a timely manner, supported by appropriately qualified and trained persons, for example, data managers or biostatisticians. And it uses data stored centrally, for example, at a clinical trials unit, to monitor processes at sites. The addendum then goes on to say that the review of accumulating data from central monitoring can be used to identify, examine and evaluate. And here it gives a series of suggestions in the outer circles of this diagram. So for example, looking at missing data, protocol deviations, variability of data within and across sites and performance metrics. And all of these could be used to select sites or processes for targeted on-site monitoring. So all of this monitoring has a financial cost. It requires time and staff. And there are some estimates to suggest that 25% of trials costs can be in monitoring alone. In recent years, there's been a move towards the idea of risk-based monitoring. So in 2013, the FDA and the EMA issued guidelines on risk-based monitoring, and this was followed in 2016 with the release of the ICH GCP addendum, which again pointed to a change to risk-based monitoring. At the same time, there's been a handful of studies showing that risk-based monitoring is acceptable, that triggers are useful, and that perhaps on-site source data verification is not as necessary as once thought. However, there's been little guidance on how we should carry out central monitoring or on-site monitoring, and few publications. So back in 2012 in the MRC CTU, we carried out a systematic search for reports of site monitoring technique comparisons in clinical trials and found very, very little work. Now, in the succeeding years, there's been several trials that have been done, but they're just reporting now, and there's still very much a lack of real guidance on what to do and what's the best process for central monitoring. So this is why in the MRC CTU, we decided that monitoring would benefit from some targeted work. We started with looking at how monitoring was done in our unit and found there was some variability. We then considered individual trials across the UK, taking this information to start designing an interventional trial for monitoring. We realised that it would need a control arm that was accepted by many to be as generalisable as possible, and that would be important for the monitoring trial to be carried out across several units. This has led to the survey that we want to talk about today. So to give you some specific information about this monitoring survey, well, monitoring is different across different phases and dependent on whether it's a trial of a CTIMP or not. So we decided that we wanted to focus in on what was happening in phase 3 CTIMPs first. We chose to survey the registered CTUs because these are the units that have reached a certain standard. And we're looking to look at central monitoring, so things like data integrity and patient safety and what's in the data management plans, and also at on-site monitoring. So that's source data verification, checking site files, training processes. We sent out this survey in November of last year to 50 extant registered CTUs. And of those, 43 responded. So that's an 86% response rate, which we're actually very pleased about. It's the best response rate in a survey on monitoring since 2011. And during that time, there have been 3 other surveys, 2 in the UK using the registered CTU. So that's Tudor Smith in 2011 and Swaby in 2017. They both came up with about 47 to 48% response rate. And there was one done in the United States by Morrison around 2011, which had a response rate of 37%. Having said that, 5 of those responses to the survey were to let us know that they had no phase 3 randomized CTIMPs at their unit, which meant that we actually had 38 giving full survey information. So I thought I'd start by giving you just some general information about those who answered the survey. We asked specifically with regard to phase 3 CTIMPs, and they generally said that they had 11 to 49 sites on average and 101 to 1,000 participants in those trials. 74% of clinical trials units conducted international trials. 35 of the 38 respondents, or 92% of units, sometimes or always conducted a risk assessment to inform the monitoring approach. But in fact, we found, looking at the free text responses, that it was 100% of CTUs had a monitoring or approach that is sometimes or always informed by a risk assessment. So 3 that said no and 1 that said yes, it's the case that the sponsor runs that risk assessment and not the unit itself. Okay, so having talked about the general type of trial and unit that we're looking at, I'll look more closely at the central monitoring results. And here I should say that one of the trials units stated that their sponsor carries out the monitoring for them. So it's the remaining questions are all from 37 respondents. So we started by asking simply, does your CTU use centrally available data to formally evaluate site or trial performance? And 92% of units said that they do this type of central monitoring. Looking at the right side of the graph, of the slide, only one never uses central monitoring to guide, target, or supplement on-site visits. We asked an additional question, which was whether the units ever used central monitoring to replace on-site monitoring. And 31% stated that they always or frequently use central monitoring to replace on-site visits. 6 of the 36 who responded to this question stated that they never use central monitoring to replace on-site visits. So we then moved on to ask about how central monitoring was carried out, with the question, how do you program central monitoring for each trial? 4 of the 36 who responded to this question, or 11% of units, use pre-written modules with some bespoke programming. 8 or 22% used bespoke central monitoring software written for each trial, and 5 or 14% used the same software for all trials. But the standout figure here is that 53% or 19 of the units, the majority of them, do not program central monitoring. Now, at this point, a unit seems to have reached question fatigue, so from here on in, only 36 units responded. We then asked, how often do you run central monitoring reports or software? Well, 20 of the 36, or 56% of them, run central monitoring at least monthly. Only 1 runs their central monitoring as infrequently as annually, although I'll also point out that we have a significant number who only run them for events or on an ad hoc basis. We then asked those who use triggered on-site monitoring how they use such triggers to decide to visit sites. 79% of clinical trials units, i.e. most of them, use a process in which triggers are human assessed, perhaps assisted by tables or graphs. We then asked those who use triggered on-site monitoring how they use such triggers to decide to visit. Only 4 units, 12%, work with software-generated guide as to which sites should be visited, which is then assessed by trial teams. We had no units who wholly use software-generated triggers without an element of human assessment. Now, at this point, we had 2 more sites that stopped answering the questionnaire, so 34 clinical trials units are still responding. We then had a series of questions that were really delving into the types of triggers that units use. Here we have the question, which of the following factors would be likely to trigger a site monitoring visit? And here you can see that consent, protocol deviations, adverse events or serious adverse events, suspected fraud and unanswered queries would be likely to trigger a site monitoring visit. Now, last year, a paper was published by Whittam et al. That suggested a set of performance metrics based on a Delphi survey. We thought we'd look at the broad categories of data that each of these metrics relates to see whether our survey respondents consider them to be factors that might trigger an on-site monitoring trip. Just for your reference, these are the 8 metrics that were suggested by Whittam et al. Briefly to go through them, we've got actual recruitment versus target recruitment, percentage of eligible individuals who consented, those randomized who've withdrawn consent, those with a query for primary outcome data, those with complete data for primary and important secondary outcomes, those with at least 1 adverse event or 1 protocol violation, and finally, the percentage of randomized participants who actually started their allocated intervention. Now, here is that slide from before. So let's look at those factors that specifically relate to the performance metrics suggested in the paper. So, of the 6 factors that were scored by more than 20 clinical trials units in our survey to be likely to trigger a site monitoring visit, 3 relate to the suggested performance metrics in the Delphi survey. We've got protocol deviations, adverse events or serious adverse events incidents, and the number of data queries. Suspected fraud, consent issues, and a number of unanswered queries were not included in the suggested metrics. The other 5 metrics, around a third or less of CTUs, considered them as factors likely to trigger a site monitoring visit. Now, it's interesting that 2 of the metrics that in discussion here at the MRC we thought might not be useful triggers, so the number eligible who consented and the number of patients who started the allocated treatment, of those, at least 1 is used by a quarter of the units who used triggering, and indeed 15% of units used both. And here I'd like to pass over to Sharon Love to go through the rest of the presentation.
Okay, so then we asked questions about on-site monitoring. So we started with asking if people did it, and all the units, so we've still got 34 units answering at this point, all of them do site visits. It's often a trial manager or a monitor, and often just one person, one of those, and each often a day. So this is a big, so this is 34 CTUs and all the phase 3 CTIMs that they do. So we're taking an average of an awful lot of things here, but it just gives us a guideline. So we asked how, oh sorry, looking on screen, we asked how the units decided when to visit a site, and we got 11 different answers. We gave them the options of when triggered, number of patients, fixed time period, and linked to a trial event. And yeah, the 34 units did 11 different things. So let me try and make some sense of this for you. So 31 of 34, 91% do triggered monitoring. So that's the blue block. Only 1 does solely triggered monitoring. So the others are doing other things along with triggered monitoring. So I can give you 2 examples here. I did a trial where we did triggered monitoring, and we also said that if we hadn't visited a site for 3 years, we would visit a site. So that would be triggered monitoring and fixed time period. And we did another trial where we did triggered monitoring, and we also visited the sites once 10 patients had been recruited. So that's an example of triggered monitoring plus number of patients. So most units are using more than one way to work out when they need to go on site. We also asked why, where they got to the frequency of going on site, where that came from. And the major things are, that more than 20 units said were study design, monitoring plan, and predefined analysis of risks with study requirements or procedures in the trial and budget coming in next. I think they're what we would expect as well. We asked how much SDV is done, and in fact this was a difficult question to fill in. We wanted to know in general what SDV was done, and 8 units felt that this was really hard to fill in because they had such a variety of SDV over their different trials. So this was only filled in by 26 of the trials units, but there was some consensus here of those ones that filled it in. Lots of them did 100% eligibility, SDV check, primary endpoint reports, consent, and SAE. So we've got some consensus there, albeit from a smaller sample. We also asked what else they did when they were on site, and here we got all 34 CTUs answering. So I've done in dark purple the ones where there is some consensus. So most units, most of the time that they're on site, assess our understanding of study procedures. They assess informed consent, updates and modifications. the regulatory documents and communications, and they check that the site file is complete. So that was the questions we asked on the survey. So just to summarise what we came up with there is that most registered CTUs do a risk assessment. Most carry out central monitoring, which is not programmed. Lots run the central monitoring at least monthly. Triggers are usually human assessed based on expected factors. And with the on-site monitoring, most registered CTUs do on-site monitoring. You can think of it as a person for a day. That's convenient. Lots do SDV while they're on site, and we had some consensus on processes that they checked. So we've learned a lot about monitoring that happens in registered CTUs. We did ask them one more question. We asked, what aspect of monitoring would you most like to change? And got the answer that was surprising to me, that optimising central monitoring was the thing that most of them would like to change. 76% said that. So we've taken that information, and our future plans are, first of all, we're going to publish the survey findings. There's a lot of information in there for someone who wants to carry out research into monitoring, so it's important to get that out so that other people can start their research as quickly as possible. And I'm also going to set up an RCT to look at different methods of central monitoring, so different triggers, bringing the on-site tasks centrally. We're thinking of it being a SWOT, a study within a trial, for about 10 trials in about 3 or 4 CTUs. So do contact Vicki or I if that is of interest to you. So thank you for listening, and are there any questions?
Thank you very much, both of you. It's Claire here. Yes, we'd be really interested in having everybody's questions. You can put them in the chat box, and I'm not sure whether Vicki and Sharon can see the chat box. If you can, if you have a look along the top, there's a little chat symbol that will allow you to see them. Otherwise, I can read them out. And also, if anybody has a microphone and would like to speak and ask your questions in person, you're very, very welcome to. I would be very interested to just start off with thinking about how you're going to practically use this information, Sharon and Vicki. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about that while we're waiting for some questions to come in?
We're going to use the information to set up a trial to find out what people want to know, which is optimising central monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
So some of it is about understanding our control arms and making sure that they're applicable to the majority of units across the UK. Obviously, we don't want to be trialling out things which are totally irrelevant to everybody.
Okay, so your survey's been really useful in that way, in allowing you to understand what's going on in those CTUs.
Indeed.
We have a question from Dale, who's asking about your survey. Is it possible that CTUs weren't aware that they could select more than one option in your survey? So, i.e. triggered monitoring only, says.
No, they could select multiple options.
And we did make it clear that things were tick multiple, tick all that apply.
Okay. Okay. So what there was a methodological question, I guess, about whether that wasn't clear to them, but that suggests that where they were ticking only one thing, that really was the case, that there was only one thing going on there. Another question from me, which is, why do you think central monitoring is not being programmed?
That was quite a surprise from the survey. We wonder whether it's a confusion between central monitoring and data cleaning. So maybe people are programming data cleaning and not realising that what they're doing is central monitoring. But there's confusion between those terms. There's a bit of confusion between several bits of language within monitoring at the moment. So we think there might be a problem there. Or it could be that people don't realise that they can program central monitoring, because often clinical databases are set up with automatic reports, and the automatic reports say something about, you know, SAEs or something you might be interested in monitoring, that people are just using those standard reports rather than actually setting up some software specifically for central monitoring.
Okay. So that confusion might be something you can sort of make sure is clear in your RCT.
Yeah,
that will help with that.
I think it all needs to be very carefully defined in any papers. Looking across the papers that have been published on monitoring, people aren't always incredibly clear with their definitions, and I think that's something that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, sure. A CTU colleague is asking about the decision to visit a site and how you can assess whether it is a correct decision or a false positive. Can you capture that, and can you sort of get a handle on that?
We ran a study from here called Temper, where we visited sites that had a high trigger count, and we matched them with sites that had a low trigger count and visited them. And we did find out that those with a high trigger count had more major or critical findings. Sorry, there was a higher percentage of sites that had one or more major or critical findings. So we are taking from that triggers do work, or can work. It's probably a better way of putting it.
Okay, thank you. You have a nice comment from Rod from the monitoring team at the NIHR Evaluation Trials and Studies Coordinating Centre. Rod doesn't want to put a question particularly, but wants to comment on how interesting this session's been from the perspective of a funder of trials. Rod, if you have I know you didn't want to put a question, but if there's any further comments you want to make and you have a microphone, I'm sure we'd all be interested to hear from you. And if anybody else has any questions and would like to put them in the chat box, please do. We don't have questions at the moment, but Sharon and Vicki, is there anything you want to add to what you've said, or any questions you have for the people who are listening?
We are interested in getting a group together of people who are interested in monitoring in the UK. So anyone who has a particular interest in this could contact me. Our contact details were on the last slide. And we think that we need to all start talking about monitoring a bit more and get our language all the same and work out what we need to do in monitoring. But we're thinking in the way that monitoring needs to be brought in line to things like the protocol and the statistical analysis plan, rather than us all working out what we think fits in with ICH. We probably need a bit more guidance on that.
Yes, and certainly making sure we're all using the same language is key to that. You mentioned, Sharon, that your contact details are on the last slide, but we can no longer see your slides. So
No.
I don't know whether you can put it back up again and move it to the last one, because you don't want to lose that opportunity for people
sorry,
to contact
my screen suddenly went blank.
That's okay.
So
anyway, I'll keep.
okay.
All right, you need to just get to the end. That would be lovely. So Sonia's asking if it's possible to identify key monitoring processes in the key groups, i.e. the ones that focus on patient safety, quality of data and trial conduct.
So yes, I mean, that's the way people are thinking. So the metrics that Vicki showed you, the 8 metrics from the Delphi survey that came out last year, they are split into those 3 groups. So I think we're all trying to make sure we do that. And in fact, when we come up with triggers, it's all got to link up really. So when you do your risk assessment and you see a risk, you've got to show that a trigger that you're doing is looking at that risk. So it does all have to be a linked up process.
Okay, thank you. And you're generating some interest in your proposed RCT. So Daryl's asked, for that RCT, What criteria would you use to categorise a CTU as a control, and what would the monitoring intervention be? And would CTUs be required to change their usual monitoring practice if randomised to the intervention? So basically, can you give us a bit of a rundown of the implications for CTUs of taking part in the RCT?
The RCT would be run as a SWOT within a trial. So it'd be run, so for example, within the MRC CTU, we'd be looking to run it as a SWOT within 3 different trials here. And the way it might work is that for a year, instead of the trial doing its monitoring, it would do the monitoring. It would do the monitoring dictated by the trial, by the overarching SWOT. So yes, you would have to stop your own monitoring, but the point being that one of the arms in the trial would be arms that you believe would be a good way of monitoring your trial.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Well, we've worked through all of the questions, and if there's anything you want to add, please do. But otherwise, I think we're wrapped up. Is there anything you want to add, Sharon and Victoria?
No, I think that's it. Just please get in contact if you're interested.
Just at the last minute, we do have one last question again from Dale. They're asking, do you think the findings are applicable to monitoring of phase 1 and 2 studies? Do you intend to do other surveys?
What we did is we were starting with asking monitoring of CTUs, and then we realised that actually not only is there variety within CTUs, it's heavily linked to phase and whether it's a CTIMP or not. So we decided that we were going to just not get clear enough answers if we looked at everything. So we specifically chose to look at phase 3 and CTIMP. And there's 2 ways we're going to move forward, and I'm not sure which the 2 yet. It might be that what we find out in phase 3 trials and CTIMPs is generalisable to others. You know, the SAP wasn't worked out for a specific thing. It's just been allowed to be generalisable to all studies. So it might be that we may be able to generalise, or it might be that what we're doing is we're showing methods of how it can be worked out in phase 3 trials, and then the same process will have to happen for other phases of trials.
Okay. Well, it looks like no other questions have last minute snuck under the radar. So I think that will wind us up for today. Thank you very much, both of you. And thank you everybody for coming. It was a nice big audience today, 80 people. And hopefully we'll see you next month for our next speaker. Thank you very much,
Claire.
Everyone. Yes.
Could I disturb you that we do have post-webinar feedback form that I have put the link to the feedback on the chat box. So I appreciate very much if you could put your feedback.
Yes,
thank you very much.
Thank you, and that is very helpful. We do look at those quite closely, and we report what people say in our annual report. So it is really helpful. And there's also a place in there where if you want to volunteer to give a webinar in the future, we would be really, really pleased to hear from you. Or if you want to recommend a topic. So that's all very helpful if you could have a quick look at that, and it doesn't take very long. Really useful. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.